Hey guys, if you happen to know a little bit of a change in the voice, I'm getting over a nice, wonderful head cold. It's the first head cold I've had since returning from the Asphalt Odyssey. 6-7 months, so I really can't complain too much. And well, that's what I guess I get for editing last week's video, which included the head cold episode in the Wolf Creek Pass saga, which made my head cold turn into a monster cold. So apparently the virus can be transmitted through video. Well, that's my story anyway. All right, today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is it about travel that draws us to it. And is it actually part of our DNA? Is it part of who we are? I tend to think so. And I'm going to talk a little about the history of our travel throughout the United States and the evolution of travel. So here we go. Over the Christmas holidays, my stepson, Mark, gave me a bottle of scotch. Thank you, Mark. It's really good scotch. But the distillery is the same distillery that a fellow named Ernest Shackleton acquired his scotch from before he went on the ill-fated trip to the South Pole in the early 1900s. If you're not familiar with that trip, you gotta do some research on this. If somebody wrote a script and sent it to Hollywood and tried to get it produced as a movie today, and if it was not true, the studio would turn it down because the story is just too fantastic. Nobody could ever do what this man, Ernest Shackleton, has done. It's so improbable that no viewer will actually buy into this. The man was a force unto himself. He went off to explore the South Pole in a wooden sailing vessel. He knew before he even left, while he was getting his people together and his equipment, that it had the risks of not coming back. Matter of fact, in the ad he put in the paper in London, men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Yes, that was the actual ad he put in the paper, and he was overwhelmed with the response. And the story is one of legends. Of course, the man was Irish. That explains so much. So the first major saga in our road trip travel discussion today occurred in the early 1800s. Thomas Jefferson had just completed the Louisiana Purchase and wanted to see what he bought. He commissioned a young military officer named Meriwether Lewis, who put together a band of young people, not necessarily young people, but about 35 people, and handpicked his lieutenant, William Clark. And their strategy was to leave the St. Louis area and go cross country as much on boat as possible. The purpose of that trip was actually multiple things in one. It was both scientific and political. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were actually appointed to do as much map making and artifact collecting as they possibly could. And it wasn't until they actually ran across the first Native Americans who encountered and who told them about the large grizzled bear, which we now know as the grizzly bear, that the party didn't believe that such an animal could actually exist. Besides that, the Corps of Discovery was armed with modern military weaponry, 50 caliber rifled bullets, so they didn't think any animal could withstand a shot from one of those. Well, they were wrong. They were attacked by a grizzled bear. The first volley took off the beast's shoulder, and it continued to lunge towards them. They had to jump into the river. Since the grizzly bear had lost a shoulder, it couldn't swim and it drowned. So the men of the Corps of Discovery won that battle by default, and they began to respect the great grizzled bear. It took them 2 years to walk in boat to the Pacific Ocean and return. The next major event in the travel history of America occurred in 1822, just a few years after the return of Lewis and Clark, and they were called the Wagon Trains. They began moving west from 1822 to 1872. The trains took several routes, most all of them leaving from St. Louis, Missouri, and were known by their names: the Santa Fe Trail, the Chisholm Trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, and the Old Spanish Trail. In simple terms, you took everything you owned, put it in the back of a wagon, and pretty much walked across the country from St. Louis to your destination on the West Coast. It was a grueling 6-month trip. The chances of dying were estimated to be about 1 in 10. Most died from accidents and disease. The most prominent disease was cholera, also called the Black Dysentery. That gives you a colorful picture of the agony these people went through. One of the big reasons for the decline of the wagon train in the early 1870s was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, with the famous last spike being driven into the ground in Promontory, Utah. One of the manufacturers of the wagons that took part in the great wagon train migration west was a company called Studebaker. That's right, Studebaker. The people who made those 1950 and early 1960 cars started out by making wagons and carts drawn by horses. One of the most famous wagons that they built is still used today. Perhaps you recognize it. It always amazes me how some of the most unremarkable people have actually had such a big influence on history. Enter this guy, Horatio Nelson Jackson, a physician living in San Francisco. The year is 1903. Jackson was an automobile enthusiast in a period of time where the last wagon trains had just ceased operations across America about 25 years before. Although the car was invented a few years back, most thought it was a passing fad and had no staying power. While Jackson was at a social event, he agreed to pay a wager of $50 to prove he can drive a four-wheeled machine across the United States. He accepted the challenge, and although he was 31 years of age, he didn't own a car and had almost no driving experience. Now don't forget, this was in a time where there were no roads, there were no maps, but Jackson was destined to make history. He made the wager on May 18th, and by May 23rd, he was heading east. He convinced a young mechanic, a Mr. Sewell Crocker, to come along for the trip. The trip had a mascot, their dog named Bud. Following telegraph lines, railroad tracks, and what was left of some of the old wagon train routes, he pulled it off. He arrived in New York City on July 26th, 63 days after starting the trip. After Nelson's successful drive across the United States, things started to happen a little quickly. In 1907, the Army bought its first truck. 1911, the Boy Scouts created the first automobiling merit badge. And in 1913, some private investors got together and formed the first transcontinental highway called the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway is not exactly what you would expect today when you say a transcontinental highway. It was a collection of existing roads and paths that had been linked together with some new stretches of roadway. Now, the roadways were dirt. Very few miles, if any, were actually paved at the beginning. So it was, what made it a roadway is it was a signed roadway, so you could actually follow the signs from the East Coast to the West Coast. And it was, for the first time, people would have a path to follow. They wouldn't have to worry about getting lost. And that was a big deal. In the year 1919, just after the World War I ended, a young Army officer named Dwight D. Eisenhower joined a military convoy to go across country. from the Washington, D.C. area to San Francisco. They were going to follow pretty much the Lincoln Highway as much as they could. Now, this was a test to see how fast they could move an Army unit across the country. Well, it took some time. Even using the Lincoln Highway, it took them 62 days. A lot of mud, a lot of hardship, a lot of bridges they had to build across gullies and rivers. It was some arduous going. And that experience stuck with Eisenhower. So when he ventured over to Europe during World War II and experienced the German Autobahn, he decided that that was something America had to have. So when he came back and became president, Dwight D. Eisenhower actually was the founder of the interstate highway system in America. Armed with the results of the military convoy across the United States by road, the federal government realized that they needed a better system and better roads to move not just military units, but people in commerce across the country to help expand the economy. And so in 1926, they developed the numbered highway system. Now, that didn't bring immediately the type of roads that we're all familiar with today with the numbered highway system. Basically what that was a routing system. It started with a simple system of east-west routes for giving even numbers. Your major routes like US 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80 moving south for the higher numbers. And then for the north-south routes, they were giving odd numbers. Near our home in Virginia is US Route 1 going from Maine to Key West. Support roads, or spur roads as they were sometimes called, were giving strange numbers like US 101 in California. Near our home there is US 58, which is not really Highway 60 and not really Highway 50, but it's just 58, using a decimal system. Now these weren't all nicely paved federal highways. They started out being some pretty coarse and rough dirt roads. They were basically signs merely connecting the existing road system for the most part. Some new roads were built to fill in the gaps, but many parts of the famous US Route 66, when it was inaugurated, would be considered by today's standards impassable or four-wheel drive only, but they were part of the federal highway system. Eventually, with enough federal money, the roads were paved, and we had a nice system of roadways in America.
So by 1970, with high-speed interstates and modern cars, you would have thought that the road trip frontier was closed. Not true. Yeah, I know, it's a rocket ship to the moon. But they took a car. Yes, they actually took a road trip on the surface of the moon, starting with Apollo 15 with the Lunar Rover in 1971.
Man, you are really bouncing. Is he on the ground at all? That's 10 kilometers. Huh? He's got about 2 wheels on the ground. He's a big rooster tail out of all 4 wheels. And as he turns, he skids, the back end breaks loose just like on snow. Come on back, John.
You know, it'd be so easy to think that all the adventure that can be had has already been had. But in my humble opinion, unless you've done it, it doesn't really count. I like to look back at history, at those folks who have blazed a path for me, and laid down an example. It doesn't make any difference if you're on a Can-Am Spyder, or just walking the Appalachian Trail, or a mountain bike through your neighborhood. The objective is to get out and enjoy life, and explore the world and explore your own consciousness. One of my favorite sayings, it doesn't make any difference which magic carpet you have, as long as the carpet gives you the magic. Life is a journey. Enjoy the trip.